Have you ever wondered why you bought something you didn't need? Why you agreed to a request against your better judgment? Why certain people seem to command respect the moment they walk into a room, while others fade into the background? What if I told you none of this happens by chance? Imagine having the ability to walk into any situation and immediately command attention, not through force or manipulation, but through an authentic presence that draws people to you naturally. Picture yourself closing deals without resistance, earning respect without demanding it, and influencing outcomes before speaking a single word. The truth is, influence isn't a mysterious talent possessed only by the naturally charismatic. It's a science, a set of psychological principles that, once understood, can transform how you interact with everyone around you. Every day, you're being influenced without realizing it. From the advertisements you see to the conversations you have, invisible psychological forces are shaping your decisions beneath the surface of conscious thought. The real question isn't whether you're being influenced. It's whether you know how to influence in return. This audiobook will take you on a journey deep into the hidden psychology that drives human behavior. I won't offer you surface-level tips or generic advice. Instead, I'll reveal the actual mechanisms that determine why people say yes, why they trust certain individuals, and why some people naturally command respect the moment they enter a room. You'll discover how to read people like an open book, how to structure your communication for maximum impact, and how to navigate social dynamics with unprecedented clarity. These aren't just theories. They're practical, proven strategies used by the world's most influential people in business, politics, and personal relationships. The most powerful part: you don't need to be naturally charismatic, aggressive, or manipulative to master these principles. The true masters of influence aren't the loudest voices in the room. They're the ones who understand the subtle psychological currents that guide human behavior, who know when to speak, when to listen, and how to guide people's thoughts without them feeling pushed or pressured. By the time you finish this audiobook, you won't just understand influence, you'll own it. You'll know exactly how to shape conversations, direct attention, and achieve your goals without friction or conflict. More importantly, you'll become someone others naturally trust, respect, and follow. Are you ready to step behind the curtain and discover how the human mind really works? Are you prepared to master the game of influence rather than be mastered by it? Let's begin. The hidden architecture of human decision-making. We like to think of ourselves as rational beings. We believe we carefully weigh evidence, consider options, and make logical choices based on facts and reason. But the truth, revealed through decades of research in psychology and neuroscience, is far more fascinating. The human mind is not a logical processor. It's a complex network of emotions, biases, and cognitive shortcuts that evolved to help us survive in environments vastly different from today's world. Our decisions, from what we buy to whom we trust, are shaped by forces operating below our conscious awareness. Understanding these hidden mechanisms isn't just academic, it's the foundation of all influence. When you grasp how people actually make decisions, rather than how they think they make decisions, you gain an extraordinary advantage in every interaction. Let's explore the true architecture of human decision-making, peeling back the layers to reveal what really drives behavior. The subconscious mind, your silent driver. Imagine your mind as an iceberg. The small portion visible above water represents your conscious thoughts, the feelings, ideas, and decisions you're aware of making. But beneath the surface lies the vast, powerful mass of your subconscious, processing millions of bits of information, forming judgments, and guiding your behavior without your awareness. Neuroscientists estimate that over 95% of brain activity occurs below the level of consciousness. Your subconscious mind processes information approximately 20,000 times faster than your conscious mind, making lightning-quick assessments based on patterns, past experiences, and instinctual reactions. This efficiency serves a purpose. If you had to consciously analyze every piece of information you encounter, you'd be paralyzed by the sheer volume of decisions. Instead, your brain creates mental shortcuts, what psychologists call heuristics, that allow you to navigate life without overthinking every step. Consider how you drive a familiar route. You don't consciously think about every turn, every brake, every acceleration. Your subconscious handles these tasks automatically, freeing your conscious mind to focus elsewhere. The same principle applies to thousands of decisions you make daily. This automatic processing is remarkably powerful, but it also makes you susceptible to influence in ways you might not recognize. Marketing professionals understand this deeply. They know that logical arguments often fail where subtle subconscious triggers succeed. When you see a red sale sign, your brain doesn't methodically analyze whether the discount represents good value. Instead, it associates red with urgency and scarcity, creating an emotional impulse to act. Quickly, when a restaurant plays slow, relaxing music, you don't consciously decide to linger longer and order more. But research shows that's exactly what happens. Those who understand subconscious influence don't need to overwhelm you with facts or pressure. They can guide your behavior through barely noticeable cues that fly beneath the radar of conscious detection. System 1 versus System 2, the battle within your brain. Nobel Prize-winning psychologist Daniel Kahneman describes two distinct thinking systems that govern our decisions. System 1 is fast, intuitive, and automatic. It makes snap judgments based on emotional reactions, past associations, and gut feelings. It requires minimal effort and operates continuously in the background of your mind. System 2 is slow, deliberate, and analytical. It engages in complex reasoning, weighs evidence, and considers multiple options. It requires mental effort and concentration. Here's the critical insight. While we believe System 2 guides most of our important decisions, the reality is that System 1 is the primary driver of our behavior. We feel the quick, intuitive judgment of System 1, then use System 2 to rationalize the decision we've already made emotionally. This explains why logical arguments often fail to persuade. When someone presents facts that contradict your existing beliefs, System 1 has already formed an emotional reaction before System 2 can analyze the information. Your mind then works backward, finding reasons to support your initial reaction rather than objectively evaluating the evidence. Master influencers understand this dynamic intimately. They know that engaging System 2 alone, presenting cold facts and logical arguments, rarely changes minds or behaviors. Instead, they target System 1, creating emotional resonance that makes their message feel right on an intuitive level. Consider political speeches. The most persuasive don't overwhelm you with policy details. They tell simple, emotionally compelling stories that trigger System 1 responses of hope, fear, or pride. Once those emotions are activated, System 2 follows along, constructing reasonable-sounding justifications for what you already feel. The same principle applies in sales, leadership, and personal relationships. When you understand how to engage System 1 effectively, logical resistance melts away as people's intuitive responses align with your message. the emotional foundation of every decision. For centuries, philosophers and scientists maintained a strict separation between emotion and reason. Emotions were seen as irrational forces that clouded judgment, while reason represented clear, objective thinking. Modern neuroscience has completely reversed this understanding. We now know that emotions aren't obstacles to good decisions. They're essential to making any decisions at all. Neurologist Antonio Damasio discovered this while studying patients with damage to the emotional centers of their brains. Despite maintaining their analytical abilities, these patients became paralyzed by indecision in everyday life. Without emotional guidance to assign value and importance to different options, even choosing what to eat for lunch became an impossible task. This research revealed a profound truth. Every decision you make is fundamentally emotional. You don't choose options because they're objectively superior. You choose them because they feel right. Logic comes afterward, justifying the choice your emotions have already made. Think about the last major purchase you made. While you likely researched features, compared prices, and created a logical framework for your decision, the final choice came down to how you felt about the options. Which one excited you? Which one felt right? Which one aligned with how you see yourself? This isn't a flaw in human reasoning. It's how our brains are designed to work. Emotions provide the essential context that makes decisions possible, assigning meaning and relevance to the endless stream of information we encounter. For influencers, this insight is transformative. It shifts the focus from winning logical arguments to creating emotional connections. When you understand that people decide based on feelings first and justify with facts later, you stop trying to overpower them with information and start engaging them on an emotional level. The most persuasive messages don't just present compelling evidence. They tell stories that create emotional resonance. They don't just highlight features and benefits. They paint a picture of how the listener will feel after saying yes. They recognize that behind every decision, from the trivial to the life-changing, lies an emotional foundation that determines the outcome. The hidden power of cognitive biases. If our minds were perfectly rational, influence would be straightforward. Present the best evidence, and people would naturally accept it. But human cognition is shaped by dozens of cognitive biases, systematic errors in thinking that affect our judgments and decisions. These biases didn't evolve by accident. They're mental shortcuts that helped our ancestors survive in a dangerous, unpredictable world where quick decisions were often more valuable than perfect ones. In modern contexts, however, they create predictable irrationality that those who understand influence can navigate strategically. Let's examine some of the most powerful biases that shape human behavior. Confirmation bias. Perhaps the most pervasive bias, confirmation bias is our tendency to seek out, favor, and remember information that confirms our existing beliefs while ignoring contradictory evidence. This is why presenting facts rarely changes someone's mind. People simply filter information through their pre-existing viewpoint. Skilled influencers don't fight this bias head-on. Instead, they frame their message to align with what the audience already believes, creating a bridge from existing views to new perspectives. Anchoring bias. The first piece of information we receive on a subject creates a powerful reference point, or anchor, that significantly influences subsequent judgments. This is why salary negotiations are profoundly affected by who names the first number, and why retail prices are often shown with original, higher prices crossed out. By strategically setting anchors, you can shape how people perceive value, making options seem more or less attractive based on the initial reference point you establish. Loss aversion. Humans feel the pain of losses approximately twice as intensely as the pleasure of equivalent gains. We're not rational calculators of value. We're deeply biased toward avoiding losses, even when taking a risk would be statistically advantageous. This is why framing a choice in terms of potential losses, "don't miss this opportunity," is often more motivating than emphasizing potential gains. Take advantage of this opportunity. Social proof. When uncertain about the correct course of action, we look to others for guidance. If many people are doing something, we assume it must be the right choice, regardless of whether we have evidence of its actual value. This explains why testimonials, reviews, and popularity markers, best-selling, most downloaded, dramatically influence decisions. They signal that others have already validated the choice, reducing the perceived risk of saying yes. Authority bias. We tend to trust and obey figures we perceive as authorities, often without questioning the validity of their statements. This deference to authority is deeply ingrained through childhood education, social structures, and evolutionary advantages of hierarchy. Markers of authority, titles, certifications, uniforms, confident speech patterns, create automatic credibility that bypasses critical evaluation. This is why advertisements feature doctors in white coats and why dressing professionally increases the likelihood that your ideas will be taken seriously. These biases represent just a fraction of the cognitive shortcuts that influence human judgment. By understanding them, you gain insight into why people make seemingly irrational decisions and how to present information in ways that work with, rather than against, the natural tendencies of the human mind. The most powerful influencers don't try to override these biases. They recognize them as fundamental aspects of how people process information and make decisions. Working within this reality, they craft messages that feel natural, compelling, and aligned with how the human mind actually functions. The psychology of persuasion, the 6 universal principles. Now that we understand the fundamental architecture of human decision-making, let's explore the specific psychological principles that drive persuasion. These aren't arbitrary techniques or manipulative tricks. They're deeply rooted patterns of human behavior that have been extensively studied and validated through decades of research. Dr. Robert Cialdini, after years of rigorous research, identified 6 universal principles that govern how people are influenced. These principles operate across cultures, contexts, and individuals, creating predictable patterns of compliance and persuasion. By understanding these principles, you gain more than techniques. You gain insight into the hidden forces that drive human behavior. More importantly, you learn how to ethically harness these forces to enhance your ability to influence, lead, and connect with others. 1. Reciprocity, the power of giving first. Deep within human psychology lies an almost universal tendency. When someone does something for us, we feel compelled to return the favor. This principle of reciprocity is so fundamental that anthropologists have discovered it operating in every human society studied. Reciprocity isn't just a social nicety, it's a survival mechanism. Early human communities thrived by ensuring mutual cooperation and resource sharing. Those who took without giving back were eventually excluded from the group, dramatically reducing their chances of survival. Over thousands of generations, the instinct to reciprocate became hardwired into our psychological makeup. Today, this ancient principle continues to exert extraordinary influence on our behavior, often without our conscious awareness. When someone offers you something, whether it's a small gift, a favor, or even just valuable information, you feel a subtle psychological pressure to give something in return. This pressure can be surprisingly powerful. In one famous study, a researcher posing as a fellow participant gave some subjects a small, unexpected gift, a can of soda. Later, when the researcher asked these subjects to purchase raffle tickets, they bought twice as many as those who hadn't received the initial gift. The simple act of receiving something created a sense of obligation that significantly influenced their behavior. The principle of reciprocity appears everywhere in influence strategies. Charities include small gifts in their donation requests. Knowing the item creates a feeling of obligation to contribute. Free samples in grocery stores make customers more likely to purchase the product. Businesses offer free consultations, knowing that once they've provided value, clients feel more inclined to hire them. Negotiators make small concessions early, creating pressure for the other party to reciprocate with concessions of their own. The key insight is that reciprocity works best when you give first, without explicit expectations. When you lead with generosity, offering help, sharing resources, providing value, you create a natural inclination for others to respond in kind. This doesn't mean calculating what you'll get in return for every favor. Transparent manipulation destroys trust and backfires. Instead, cultivate a genuine orientation toward adding value and serving others. When reciprocity emerges naturally from authentic generosity, it creates powerful, positive influence that strengthens relationships rather than exploiting them. 2. Commitment and consistency. The power of small yeses. Once people take a stand or make a choice, they encounter enormous internal and external pressure to behave consistently with that commitment. This drive for consistency stems from both psychological and social factors. We want to feel coherent in our own minds, and we know that inconsistency is judged harshly by others. The commitment and consistency principle explains why small initial actions can lead to much larger behaviors. Once someone has taken a position, they tend to act in ways that justify their previous decision, even when the stakes increase significantly. In a groundbreaking study, psychologist Jonathan Friedman asked homeowners if they would display a small postcard supporting a Drive Safely campaign. Most agreed to this modest request. 2 weeks later, different researchers approached the same homeowners, asking if they would install a large, obtrusive Drive Safely billboard on their lawn. Among those who had not made the earlier commitment with the postcard, only 17% agreed to the billboard. But among those who had made the small initial commitment, 76% consented to the much larger request. Why? Once people had identified themselves as supporters of traffic safety, through the small commitment, refusing the larger request would have created inconsistency. To maintain their self-image and appear consistent, they agreed to a request they would otherwise have refused. This principle manifests in countless influence strategies. Free trials convert to paid subscriptions because once customers start using a product, continuing feels more consistent than stopping. Public commitments, like signing a pledge or announcing a goal, dramatically increase follow-through because people strive to appear consistent. Salespeople secure small agreements throughout a conversation, building a pattern of saying, "Yes." That makes the final decision feel like a natural continuation. Foot-in-the-door techniques start with tiny requests before escalating to larger ones, using the commitment to the small request as leverage. The most effective application of this principle comes through voluntary, public commitments. When someone chooses to take a position openly, the drive for consistency becomes particularly strong. They're now motivated both by internal psychological coherence and by social pressure to appear consistent to others. To ethically leverage this principle, focus on helping people make positive initial commitments aligned with their values. Rather than manipulating people into positions they don't believe in, guide them toward authentic commitments that activate their natural drive for consistency in beneficial directions. 3. Social proof, the power of what others do. When uncertain about the correct course of action, humans instinctively look to others for guidance. This tendency, what psychologists call social proof, serves as a powerful mental shortcut when we don't have the time, energy, or expertise to thoroughly evaluate every situation. Social proof operates on a simple assumption. If many people are doing something, it's probably the right thing to do. This heuristic evolved for good reason. Throughout human history, following the crowd often led to better outcomes than striking out alone. Those who ate what others ate were less likely to be poisoned. Those who adopted the group's behaviors were more likely to be accepted and protected. In modern contexts, this ancient psychological mechanism continues to exert enormous influence on our decisions. Consider these research findings. Hotel guests are 26% more likely to reuse towels when told that the majority of other guests do so. Donations to charity increase significantly when fundraisers mention that others have already contributed. People are far more likely to help in an emergency if they see others helping first. Laugh tracks in television shows increase audience laughter, even when viewers know the laugh's area artificial. The more similar the others are to us, the more powerful their influence becomes. We're most strongly affected by the behavior of people we identify with, those who share our characteristics, circumstances, or values. Uncertainty amplifies social proof's effect. When we're confused, facing an unfamiliar situation, or lacking clear guidelines, our reliance on others' behavior increases dramatically. In ambiguous circumstances, social cues become our primary decision-making criteria. This explains why businesses leverage testimonials from people like you, why websites display view counts and download numbers, and why restaurants deliberately seat customers near windows to create the appearance of popularity to passers-by. The digital landscape has created unprecedented opportunities to harness social proof. Online reviews, follower counts, engagement metrics, and user testimonials all signal what others are doing, thinking, and choosing. Each serves as a form of evidence that influences decision-making without requiring direct argumentation. To ethically apply this principle, focus on authentically demonstrating how others have benefited from a product, service, or idea. Rather than manufacturing false consensus, highlight genuine social momentum. Show real examples of others, particularly those similar to your audience, who have already taken the action you're suggesting. When people see that others like them have made a choice and experienced positive outcomes, the psychological path of least resistance leads toward the same decision. 4. Liking, the power of connection. Humans are fundamentally social creatures, wired to cooperate with those we feel connected to. We prefer to say yes to people we like, and we like people who share our qualities, compliment us, cooperate with us, and make positive associations with things we value. The liking principle might seem obvious. Of course, we're more influenced by people we like, but its implications and applications run deeper than most realize. Research consistently demonstrates the remarkable power of liking in influence and persuasion. Negotiators who spend time getting to know their counterparts personally before beginning discussions reach more favorable agreements 90% of the time. Customers are more likely to purchase from salespeople they perceive as similar to themselves in background, interests, or opinions. Job candidates with personal connections to someone in the company are 16 times more likely to be hired than those without connections. People are more persuaded by arguments from physically attractive sources, even when the attractiveness has no relevance to the message. What creates liking? Several factors consistently trigger this response. Similarity. We like people who are like us, whether it's shared backgrounds, values, interests, or even superficial traits like a birthday or name. Perceived similarity creates immediate affinity. This is why effective communicators quickly find and highlight commonalities with their audience. Compliments. We like people who like us. Even when we recognize flattery as deliberate, it still creates positive feelings toward the person offering it. Sincere compliments activate the brain's reward centers in the same way that receiving money does. Cooperation. We like people who work with us toward mutual goals. When we feel someone is collaborating rather than competing, we develop stronger positive feelings toward them. This is why framing requests as collaborative efforts, "we're in this together," increases compliance. Positive association. We like people who connect us to positive experiences. This explains why celebrities endorsing products work so effectively. Our positive feelings toward the celebrity transfer to the product. The same principle applies when people deliver good news or create enjoyable interactions. Familiarity. We generally like what's familiar. Repeated exposure to a person or idea typically increases our positive feelings toward it. This is why candidates with recognizable names have an advantage in elections, and why repetition in advertising builds positive brand associations. To ethically apply the liking principle, focus on building genuine connections before attempting to influence. Take time to find authentic similarities, offer sincere appreciation, and frame interactions as cooperative rather than adversarial. Rather than viewing liking as a manipulative technique, see it as fundamental relationship building that enhances communication and creates positive context for influence. When people like you, persuasion becomes less about overcoming resistance and more about guiding people who are already inclined to consider your perspective. 5. Authority, the power of credible expertise. From childhood, we're taught to respect and obey authority figures. Parents, teachers, religious leaders, and government officials all shape our understanding of what's correct, acceptable, and true. This deference to authority becomes so deeply ingrained that it often operates automatically, bypassing conscious evaluation. Stanley Milgram's famous experiments in the 1960s dramatically demonstrated the power of authority. When instructed by a researcher in a lab coat to administer what they believed were painful electric shocks to another person, approximately 65% of participants complied fully, despite the apparent distress of the victim, who was actually an actor. The simple presence of perceived authority, symbolized by a title and white coat, was enough to override participants' ethical concerns and personal reluctance. While this extreme example highlights authority's dangerous potential, the same psychological mechanism operates in countless benign situations daily. We follow doctors' orders, trust expert opinions, and comply with requests from those we perceive as having legitimate expertise or status. The influence of authority stems from a sensible shortcut. Throughout human development, Following those with greater knowledge and power generally improved survival chances and social standing. In complex societies with specialized knowledge, deferring to genuine authorities often leads to better outcomes than attempting to evaluate everything independently. Authority triggers compliance through several signals. Titles, designations like doctor, professor, CEO, or judge create instant credibility. Studies show that people are more likely to follow medical advice when it comes from someone introduced as a doctor, and more likely to accept financial guidance from someone with professional credentials. Clothing and symbols. Uniforms, formal attire, and symbolic items like badges, certificates, or expensive watches serve as visual shorthand for authority and expertise. Even subtle cues like wearing a suit or displaying framed diplomas significantly increase perceived credibility. Confidence in tone. Authoritative communication, speaking clearly, decisively, and with conviction, enhances perceptions of expertise. People intuitively associate certainty with knowledge, often trusting those who project confidence more than those who acknowledge limitations. Social recognition. Third-party endorsements, media coverage, and association with established institutions all transfer authority to individuals. Being introduced as a leading expert or having your work mentioned by recognized authorities dramatically increases your influence. To ethically leverage this principle, focus on establishing genuine expertise rather than merely its symbols. Develop deep knowledge, earn relevant credentials, and communicate your qualifications honestly. Present evidence of your authority, whether through case studies, testimonials, or demonstrations of skill, in ways that help others make informed decisions rather than manipulating them through empty signaling. When you possess actual expertise in an area, making that expertise visible isn't manipulation. It's providing valuable context that helps others benefit from your knowledge. 6. Scarcity, the power of potential loss. Human beings value what's rare, exclusive, or diminishing in availability. This response isn't just a social construction. It's hardwired into our psychology through thousands of generations of evolution. Resources that were scarce were often essential for survival, making sensitivity to scarcity a vital adaptive trait. Today, this ancient psychological trigger continues to exert powerful influence on our decisions, often overriding rational analysis. When we believe something is becoming less available, we want it more urgently and value it more highly, even when its intrinsic qualities haven't changed. In a classic study, researchers evaluated the impact of scarcity on perceived value. They presented participants with a cookie jar containing either 10 cookies, abundant condition, or 2 cookies, scarce condition. Though the cookies were identical, participants rated the scarce cookies as significantly more desirable, more expensive tasting, and more valuable. This principle explains countless influence strategies. Limited time offers create urgency that accelerates purchasing decisions. Exclusive memberships and VIP access feel more valuable precisely because they're restricted. Collectors pay premium prices for rare items, even when abundant alternatives serve the same functional purpose. Only 3 left in stock. Notifications on websites drive immediate purchases. What makes scarcity so effective? 2 key psychological mechanisms. Loss aversion. Humans feel the pain of losses much more acutely than the pleasure of equivalent gains. When something becomes scarce, we frame access to it as a potential loss rather than a potential gain, dramatically increasing our motivation to acquire it. This is why "don't miss out" messaging is typically more effective than "take advantage of" messaging. The former triggers our innate fear of loss. Psychological reactance. When our freedom to choose is threatened, we instinctively react against the restriction. This response, called psychological reactance, intensifies our desire for whatever is being limited. It's why telling someone they can't have something often makes them want it more, and why exclusive or members-only offers can be irresistibly attractive. Information scarcity works similarly. Knowledge that isn't widely available, insider information, industry secrets, or confidential reports, tends to be valued more highly than publicly accessible information, even when the content is identical. To ethically apply the scarcity principle, focus on highlighting genuine limitations rather than manufacturing false ones. If a product truly is limited in quantity, if an opportunity genuinely will expire, or if certain benefits are legitimately exclusive, communicating these facts helps people make informed decisions about what they value. The most powerful application combines scarcity with concrete reasons. When people understand why something is limited, special ingredients, artisanal production, capacity constraints, the scarcity becomes more credible and compelling than arbitrary restrictions. Framing and perception, how context shapes reality. When asked how much a loaf of bread costs, many people reply with a number from a nearby store. But what determines the right price? Is it the supermarket special at $2.99, the artisanal bakery loaf at $7.50, the mass-produced discount brand at $1.49? The truth is, there is no objective right price, only perceptions of value shaped by context. This illustrates one of the most powerful principles in influence. Perception is reality. People don't respond to the objective world. They respond to their subjective interpretation of it. And those interpretations are profoundly shaped by how information is presented, what psychologists call framing. Understanding how framing works gives you the ability to ethically shape how others perceive information, options, and decisions, without changing any substantive facts. The art of strategic framing. Framing is simply the context or presentation that surrounds information. It's the difference between describing a medical procedure as having a 90% survival rate versus a 10% mortality rate. Identical facts that trigger vastly different emotional responses. Research consistently shows that how options are framed dramatically influences decision-making. Consumers are more likely to buy meat labeled 85% lean than identical meat labeled 15% fat. Patients choose different treatments when outcomes are framed in terms of survival chances versus mortality risks. Shoppers perceive greater value when an item is framed as $100, now $70 versus simply $70. Voters respond differently to economic policies framed as job creation versus reducing gun employment. The power of framing comes from our tendency to perceive information relationally rather than absolutely. We interpret data points by comparing them to reference points, and different frames activate different reference points. Several framing strategies are particularly influential. Gain versus loss framing. People respond differently when identical outcomes are framed as gains versus losses. Loss framing, "don't lose your retirement savings," typically generates stronger reactions than gain framing, "build your retirement savings," due to the psychological principle of loss aversion. Contrast framing. The perceived value of an option changes dramatically depending on what it's compared to. Real estate agents often show less attractive properties before the one they actually want to sell, making the target property seem more appealing by contrast. Similarly, a $40 wine appears reasonable after seeing a $100 option, but expensive when positioned next to a $15 alternative. Problem-solution framing. How a problem is defined determines what solutions seem appropriate. Framing obesity as a matter of personal willpower suggests different interventions than framing it as an environmental issue or a metabolic condition. By defining the problem, you establish the parameters for acceptable solutions. Time framing. The same cost feels different when framed across different time periods. $1,000 per year feels more expensive than $2.74 per day for the same annual amount. Similarly, future outcomes feel less impactful than immediate ones, which is why marketers often break costs into small monthly payments while emphasizing immediate benefits. Identity framing. Connecting choices to identity creates powerful influence. Framing a decision as what kind of person would do X, rather than simply should you do X, activates deeper psychological drivers. This explains why marketing often focuses less on product features and more on what purchasing says about the consumer's identity. The contrast principle, the power of relative perception. Perhaps the most powerful framing mechanism is the contrast principle, our tendency to perceive things in relation to what preceded them rather than by their objective qualities. If you place your hand in hot water and then move it to room temperature water, the room temperature water will feel cool. Place your hand in cold water first, and the same room temperature water will feel warm. The water hasn't changed, only your reference point has. The same principle operates in decision-making and perception. Real estate agents understand this well. They often show clients less attractive properties before the one they intend to sell. By comparison, the target property seems much more appealing than if viewed in isolation. Retailers apply the same principle. A $2,000 suit makes a $200 tie seem reasonable, when the tie might have appeared expensive if presented alone. Placing premium products next to standard offerings doesn't just increase the chance of selling the premium option. It also boosts sales of the standard product, which now seems like a bargain by comparison. Negotiators leverage contrast by making an initial request substantially larger than their actual target. When they later concede to a smaller request, it seems reasonable by comparison, even though it might have been rejected if presented initially. The contrast principle works because our brains are wired to notice differences rather than absolute values. We're highly sensitive to changes, but remarkably poor at evaluating things in isolation. By controlling the sequence of information and deliberately establishing reference points, you can profoundly influence how subsequent options are perceived. The psychology of storytelling, framing through narrative. While facts inform, stories transform. The human brain is uniquely wired for narrative. We process, remember, and respond to information differently when it's presented as a story rather than as abstract data. Neuroscience research reveals that when we hear straightforward facts, only the language processing parts of our brain activate. But when we encounter narrative, multiple additional brain regions engage, including those responsible for sensory processing, emotional response, and personal experience. In essence, we don't just understand stories intellectually, we experience them neurologically. This makes storytelling one of the most powerful framing tools available. A compelling narrative doesn't just convey information. It creates a mental and emotional context that shapes how that information is perceived and remembered. Consider climate change communication. Presenting statistical data about rising temperatures rarely motivates action, but telling the story of a specific community facing water shortages or a family losing their home to increased flooding creates emotional engagement that raw data cannot. Effective stories in influence and persuasion typically share several key elements. Relatable characters. Stories featuring protagonists similar to the audience create immediate connection and identification. When we see ourselves in a story, we process it more personally. Emotional journey. Effective narratives include emotional components that activate the limbic system, the brain's emotional center. This emotional activation is essential for memory formation and motivational impact. Concrete details. Specific, sensory details make stories vivid and believable. Saying, "The temperature rose 2 degrees," creates less impact than describing, "The playground equipment became too hot for children to touch." Clear structure. Stories with a recognizable beginning, middle, and end, particularly those that show transformation or resolution, create cognitive satisfaction and enhance recall. Values activation. Stories that align with or affirm core values create stronger persuasive impact than those that challenge existing beliefs. Effective narratives often begin where the audience is, then gently expand their perspective. The most powerful aspect of storytelling is that it bypasses rational resistance. When arguments are presented directly, they trigger analytical evaluation and potential counterarguments. But stories engage us in a different way. We temporarily suspend disbelief and lower our cognitive defenses as we become immersed in the narrative. This doesn't mean manipulating people through fiction. Rather, it means recognizing that human understanding has always been shaped through narrative, and that abstracting information away from human experience often diminishes its impact and meaning. By framing information within compelling narratives, you help people process, internalize, and remember your message in ways that pure data and logical arguments simply cannot achieve. Building trust, the foundation of lasting influence. In a world increasingly characterized by skepticism and information overload, trust has become the most valuable currency of influence. Without trust, even the most perfectly crafted messages fall flat. With trust, even imperfect communication can create powerful impact. Trust isn't just one factor among many in the influence equation. It's the foundation upon which all other principles rest. Reciprocity works because people trust that their generosity will be acknowledged. Authority functions because people trust that expertise is legitimate. Social proof operates because people trust the wisdom of crowds. Understanding how trust forms, how it deepens, and how it can be maintained is essential for anyone seeking to build lasting influence rather than fleeting compliance. The science of trust formation. Trust isn't a mystical feeling or a lucky accident. It's a neurobiological process with predictable patterns. When we trust someone, our brains release oxytocin, a neurochemical that promotes bonding and cooperation. This same chemical is involved in parent-child bonds, romantic attachments, and close friendships. Research shows that trust assessments happen with remarkable speed, often within milliseconds of meeting someone. These rapid judgments occur primarily along two dimensions that researchers call warmth and competence. Warmth reflects our perception of someone's intentions toward us. Do they have our best interests at heart? Are they genuinely concerned about our welfare? Warmth signals include eye contact, authentic smiling, open body language, and expressions of empathy and understanding. Competence reflects our assessment of someone's ability to act on their intentions. Are they capable? Do they have the knowledge, skills, and resources to deliver what they promise? Competence signals include confident communication, demonstrated expertise, relevant credentials, and evidence of past success. Together, these dimensions create a trust matrix. High warmth, high competence, admiration and full trust. High warmth, low competence, sympathy but limited trust. Low warmth, high competence, respect but suspicion. Low warmth, low competence, contempt and distrust. While many influence attempts focus exclusively on demonstrating competence, building credibility, highlighting achievements, establishing expertise, this approach addresses only half of the trust equation. Without corresponding warmth, competence alone creates respect but not connection, and connection is essential for deep influence. The most trusted figures and organizations effectively balance both dimensions. They demonstrate genuine care alongside clear capability, creating a foundation of trust that enables meaningful influence. The three pillars of trustworthiness. Beyond the initial assessments of warmth and competence, deeper trust develops through consistent demonstration of three core qualities: integrity, benevolence, and reliability. Integrity is alignment between words and actions, values and behaviors. It's demonstrated through honesty, transparency, and moral consistency. When people believe you say what you mean and mean what you say, especially when honesty comes at a personal cost, trust deepens significantly. Benevolence is genuine concern for others' welfare. It's demonstrated through empathy, generosity, and putting others' needs alongside or ahead of your own. When people believe you genuinely care about them, not just what you can get from them, they become far more receptive to your influence. Reliability is consistent fulfillment of expectations and commitments. It's demonstrated through dependability, punctuality, and follow-through. When people can predict your behavior and count on your promises, even in small matters, they become increasingly willing to trust you with larger ones. These pillars reinforce each other. Integrity without reliability creates inconsistent trustworthiness. Benevolence without integrity makes good intentions ineffective. Reliability without benevolence creates transactional rather than relational trust. Together, these qualities create the trustworthiness triad that forms the foundation of all meaningful, lasting influence. Vulnerability, the counterintuitive trust accelerator. Perhaps the most powerful and misunderstood aspect of trust building is the role of vulnerability. Most people assume that showing weakness or admitting limitations diminishes trust. In reality, appropriate vulnerability often accelerates and deepens trust formation. This happens because perfect people aren't trustworthy, they're suspicious. When someone presents an image of flawless competence, never acknowledging mistakes or limitations, it triggers subconscious skepticism. We instinctively recognize that no one is perfect, so those who pretend to be perfect seem inauthentic. Psychologists call this the pratfall effect, the finding that competent people who make minor mistakes are often more likable and relatable than those who appear flawless. A small demonstration of vulnerability humanizes competence and makes it more believable. This doesn't mean broadcasting serious incompetence or oversharing personal struggles. Rather, it means having the confidence to acknowledge normal human limitations. Phrases like, "I don't know, but I'll find out," or "I made a mistake with that estimate," don't diminish genuine authority. They enhance it by demonstrating honesty and authenticity. Vulnerability also creates reciprocity in trust formation. When you show appropriate vulnerability first, others feel safer being vulnerable with you in return. This mutual openness builds deeper connection than perfectly polished interactions ever could. The trust paradox is this: to be trusted more, you sometimes need to appear less perfect. Acknowledging appropriate limitations doesn't diminish your influence. It makes your actual strengths more credible and your communication more impactful. Trust across distance, building credibility without direct contact. While traditional trust formation happens through in-person interactions, modern influence often requires building trust with people we may never meet face to face. Whether through digital communication, media presence, or reputation, building distance trust requires specific strategies. Borrowed trust. One of the most effective ways to establish credibility without direct interaction is through association with already trusted entities. This can include endorsements from respected figures, affiliation with established institutions, or certification from recognized authorities. When someone trusts Source A and Source A vouches for you, some of that trust transfers to you automatically. Transparency. In the absence of direct interaction, transparency becomes even more crucial for trust formation. Being open about your processes, acknowledging both strengths and limitations, and providing clear information about who you are and how you operate creates trust in contexts where personal warmth can't be directly conveyed. Consistency. When people can't assess you directly, they rely heavily on consistency as a trust signal. Consistent messaging, visual identity, tone, and delivery create a sense of stability and reliability that fosters trust even without personal connection. Erratic or contradictory communication, by contrast, quickly erodes distance trust. Social validation. In digital contexts, visible endorsement from others serves as a critical trust proxy. Reviews, testimonials, engagement metrics, and public feedback provide evidence that others have already extended their trust, making it safer for new individuals to do the same. Value-first engagement. Perhaps the most powerful strategy for building distance trust is consistently providing value without immediate expectation of return. When you repeatedly deliver genuine value through content, insights, or assistance, you demonstrate both competence and benevolence, establishing the essential components of trust before ever asking for anything in return. These strategies don't replace the fundamental mechanics of trust formation, but they adapt those mechanics to contexts where direct personal interaction isn't possible or practical. Repairing broken trust. Even with the best intentions, trust can be damaged. Understanding how to effectively repair broken trust is essential for maintaining influence in long-term relationships and contexts. Research shows that trust repair follows a predictable pattern, with specific elements required for effective restoration. Acknowledgement. The first and most crucial step is fully acknowledging the breach of trust. Attempts to minimize, justify, or deflect responsibility typically backfire, deepening rather than healing the damage. Effective acknowledgement is specific and complete, demonstrating that you understand exactly what went wrong and how it affected others. Responsibility. Taking clear ownership of the problem, without qualifications or excuses, is essential for rebuilding credibility. Phrases like, "I made a mistake," or "I failed to deliver what I promised," signal integrity and maturity, beginning the process of rebuilding trust. Empathy. Beyond acknowledging facts, effective trust repair requires emotional understanding. demonstrating that you genuinely comprehend how your actions made others feel, and that you care about that impact, creates the foundation for reconnection. Explanation, not excuse. While excuses damage trust repair, a straightforward explanation of what happened can help prevent similar issues in the future. The key distinction: explanations help others understand what went wrong without attempting to escape responsibility for it. Corrective action. Words alone rarely restore trust. Concrete actions are required. Implementing specific, visible changes that address the root cause of the trust breach demonstrates genuine commitment to improvement rather than merely seeking to escape consequences. Consistency over time. Perhaps most importantly, trust is rebuilt through consistent demonstration of trustworthiness after the breach. This often requires accepting that the relationship may operate with increased verification or reduced autonomy initially, gradually returning to normal as trust is re-established through reliable behavior. The most effective trust repair combines emotional and practical elements, addressing both the relationship damage and the substantive issues that caused it. While severe trust violations may never be fully repaired, many trust breaches can be overcome through this systematic approach, eventually creating relationships that are stronger for having successfully navigated the challenge. The psychology of social dynamics, reading and controlling the room. Beyond understanding the individual mind, mastering influence requires comprehending how people interact in groups and social settings. Social dynamics, the invisible currents of energy, status, and connection that flow through human gatherings, profoundly shape individual behavior, often overriding personal preferences and rational thinking. While many struggle to navigate these complex currents, those who understand the psychology of social dynamics can read situations accurately, adjust their approach appropriately, and guide group behavior with remarkable precision. The hidden hierarchy, status and dominance in social interactions. Every human group, from casual gatherings to formal organizations, develops status hierarchies, implicit rankings that determine whose opinions carry more weight, who receives more attention, and who influences collective decisions. These hierarchies aren't just organizational charts or formal positions. They're psychological realities that can either align with or diverge from official structures. Status hierarchies form automatically and rapidly, often within minutes of group formation. Research shows that even when groups are composed of strangers with no formal differences in authority, clear status differences emerge through subtle signals and behaviors. Several factors consistently influence status allocation. Confidence signals. Those who display confident body language, speak with certainty, and occupy physical space tend to be accorded higher status automatically. Postural expansion, standing tall, using broad gestures, maintaining steady eye contact, and speaking at a measured pace all signal high status and typically elicit deference from others. Contribution value. Individuals who provide unique and valuable input to group goals typically rise in status. This explains why technical experts often hold informal influence beyond their organizational rank, and why those who solve pressing problems quickly gain respect. Apparent control. Those who appear unruffled by pressure, who maintain composure when others become emotional, and who demonstrate mastery over their environment naturally rise in perceived status. Conversely, visible anxiety, reactivity, or environment-triggered stress tends to lower status attribution. Social proof. Individuals who already receive respect and attention from others automatically appear more status-worthy to newcomers. This creates status momentum. Those accorded high status initially tend to maintain or increase that status over time. Resource control. Those who control valued resources, whether information, connections, opportunities, or physical goods, naturally obtain higher status. This resource control creates dependence, increasing influence regardless of formal position. Understanding status dynamics allows you to accurately assess power structures in any group, identify the true decision makers, who may not hold the highest formal positions, and align your influence attempts with existing social reality. Subconscious synchronization, how groups think and feel together. Beyond explicit communication, humans constantly engage in subconscious synchronization, automatically aligning their emotions, thinking patterns, and even physical movements with those around them. This synchronization happens through several fascinating mechanisms. Emotional contagion. Emotions spread through groups like viruses, transferring from person to person through subtle facial expressions, vocal tones, and body language. This happens automatically, below conscious awareness, which is why you might find yourself feeling anxious in an anxious group or energized in an enthusiastic one, without any explicit communication about emotions. Mirror neurons. The human brain contains specialized cells that activate when we observe others performing actions or expressing emotions. These mirror neurons create internal simulations of what we observe, allowing us to literally feel what others feel. This neurological mirroring explains why yawns are contagious, why watching someone in pain activates our own pain centers, and why enthusiasm and anxiety both spread rapidly through groups. Behavioral mimicry. People naturally mimic the physical behaviors of those around them, adopting similar postures, gestures, speaking rhythms, and even breathing patterns. This mimicry happens automatically and creates feelings of connection and rapport. Research shows that greater behavioral synchronization correlates with higher levels of trust and cooperation between individuals. Thought convergence. Groups naturally develop shared thinking patterns over time, creating collective blind spots and assumptions. This cognitive convergence explains why teams often fail to see obvious solutions that outsiders immediately notice, and why organizations develop cultures that feel natural to insiders but strange to newcomers. These synchronization mechanisms create powerful group effects that influence individual behavior, often without people realizing they're being affected. Understanding these dynamics allows you to maintain independence when needed and deliberately influence group states when appropriate. Energy control, setting and shifting the atmosphere. One of the most powerful aspects of social influence is the ability to control emotional energy, to shift the atmosphere of a room, conversation, or relationship in a desired direction. While many people experience this as mysterious chemistry or vibe, it's actually a learnable skill grounded in psychological principles. Emotional energy affects everything from decision-making speed to risk tolerance, creativity, and openness to new ideas. By understanding how to set and shift energy states, you can create optimal conditions for different types of influence. Entrance impact. The first moments of entering a social space disproportionately affect how your presence will be perceived. When you enter with calm confidence, positive energy, and focused attention, you immediately influence the atmosphere. This entrance effect explains why skilled leaders and connectors pause briefly before entering important spaces, consciously setting their energy to create the desired impact. Pacing and leading. One of the most powerful energy control techniques involves first matching the existing emotional state, pacing, before gradually shifting toward your desired state, leading. Rather than fighting current energy directly, you first synchronize with it, establishing connection before guiding toward a more productive state. This is why effective crisis leaders first acknowledge current anxieties before building toward calm resolve. Contrast creation. Deliberately breaking expected patterns creates immediate attention and energy shifts. Lowering your voice instead of raising it during disagreement, slowing your pace when urgency is expected, or introducing calm silence in high-energy environments creates pattern interrupts that reset group dynamics and create space for new directions. Emotional conduction. Strong, authentic emotional states are contagious, allowing you to deliberately infect others with productive emotions like enthusiasm, curiosity, or determination. This isn't about manufacturing fake emotions, but about genuinely accessing and amplifying feelings that will serve the situation. The key insight: you can't transmit what you don't genuinely feel, which is why internal emotional management precedes external influence. Physical positioning. Spatial arrangement dramatically affects energy flow and influence patterns. Central positioning increases perceived authority. Circular arrangements promote equal participation. Standing creates higher energy than sitting. Proximity increases influence impact. By consciously managing physical positioning, you can significantly enhance or modulate your influence on group energy. Master communicators understand that content, what you say, matters less than context, the emotional and energetic environment in which it's received. By learning to read and control the invisible energy currents flowing through social interactions, you can create conditions where your ideas, suggestions, and perspectives land with maximum impact. Nonverbal dominance, the body language of influence. While verbal communication delivers content, nonverbal communication establishes context, relationship, and power dynamics. Research consistently shows that when verbal and nonverbal messages conflict, people instinctively trust the nonverbal signals, often without conscious awareness of the discrepancy. This makes nonverbal communication the dominant channel for establishing credibility, trustworthiness, and influence potential. Several nonverbal dimensions particularly impact influence effectiveness. Status display. High-status nonverbals include controlled, deliberate movements, comfortable claiming of personal space, relaxed posture with open gestures, and steady eye contact. These signals trigger instinctive respect and attention, creating a foundation for influence even before speaking. Conversely, rapid, nervous movements, compressed posture, and darting eye contact signal low status, undermining influence attempts regardless of verbal content. Congruence. Alignment between verbal and nonverbal messaging creates an impression of authenticity and conviction. When your body, voice, and words all communicate the same message, credibility soars. Incongruence. Saying confident words with uncertain body language, for instance, creates subconscious distrust that undermines influence. This explains why rehearsing important communications improves effectiveness. Practice increases congruence between channels. Attentional focus. Where you direct your attention non-verbally significantly affects your influence. Maintaining complete focus on the person you're speaking with, rather than checking your phone, scanning the room, or showing distraction, creates powerful connection that enhances persuasive impact. This presence quality is increasingly rare and correspondingly valuable in creating meaningful influence. Voice modulation. Beyond words themselves, vocal qualities like pace, pitch, volume, and tone dramatically affect how messages are received. Lower pitch generally increases perceived authority. Variable pace creates engagement. Strategic pauses create emphasis and attention. Downward vocal inflection at sentence ends signals confidence, while upward inflection suggests uncertainty. Mastering these paralinguistic elements allows you to deliver identical content with radically different impact. Proxemics and touch. Physical distance and appropriate touch significantly influence relationship development and persuasion effectiveness. Closer proximity within cultural norms increases emotional impact. Brief, appropriate touch, like a handshake, shoulder touch, or hand on forearm, has been shown to increase compliance with requests, improve tips in service settings, and enhance perceived trustworthiness. Nonverbal mastery isn't about manufacturing signals, but about removing inconsistencies between what you intend to communicate and what your body naturally expresses. The most powerful approach is developing genuine internal confidence, conviction, and presence, allowing your nonverbal communication to authentically align with your message, rather than trying to mechanically control each gesture and expression. Reading the room, social intelligence in action. Beyond projecting influence, the ability to accurately read social dynamics, to sense unspoken tensions, identify true decision makers, and understand emotional currents, provides crucial intelligence for effective communication. This skill, sometimes called social intuition, combines observation, pattern recognition, and empathetic awareness. Several specific aspects of room reading particularly enhance influence effectiveness. Power mapping. Identifying who influences whom in any group provides essential navigation information. Notice who others look at when someone makes a statement, indicating respect for their opinion. Watch who interrupts without consequence versus who gets interrupted, indicating status differences. Notice whose suggestions get implemented versus acknowledged but ignored. These observations reveal the true influence structure, which often differs from the formal hierarchy. Energy assessment. Every gathering has an emotional atmosphere, energized or subdued, collaborative or competitive, optimistic or anxious. Before attempting influence, assess this baseline state to determine whether it supports your goals or requires shifting. Attempting to generate enthusiasm in a crisis-focused group, for instance, will likely fail without first addressing underlying concerns. Alliance identification. Groups naturally form subgroups and alliances based on shared interests, history, and perspectives. Observing who sits together, who exchanges glances during discussions, and who defends each other's positions reveals these alliance patterns. Understanding these connections helps you anticipate how support or resistance might spread through the group when you present ideas. Receptivity cues. Subtle signals indicate openness to influence or active resistance. Leaning forward, nodding, relaxed brow, and direct eye contact typically signal receptivity. Crossed arms, compressed lips, minimal nodding, and reduced eye contact often indicate resistance. Recognizing these signals allows you to adjust your approach in real time, addressing concerns before they're verbalized or capitalizing on openness when it appears. Unspoken concerns. What isn't being said often matters more than what is. Notice topics that create sudden silence, issues that get repeatedly framed in vague terms, or questions that receive deflective answers. These patterns typically indicate sensitive areas where influence requires special care. Addressing these unspoken concerns, directly but tactfully, often unblocks resistance that would otherwise remain invisible but powerful. Reading the room effectively requires balancing attention between content, what's being explicitly communicated, and context, all the unspoken dynamics surrounding that communication. By developing this dual awareness, You gain crucial intelligence that helps you time interventions appropriately, frame messages effectively, and navigate complex social environments with precision. The dark side of influence: manipulation, resistance, and ethical boundaries. Understanding the psychology of influence brings responsibility. The same principles that can inform, persuade, and lead can also be used to manipulate, deceive, and exploit. Recognizing the difference between ethical influence and manipulation is crucial, both to ensure your own practices remain honorable and to protect yourself from those who would use these powerful tools against you. In this section, we'll explore the dark side of influence, how psychological principles can be misused, how to recognize manipulation attempts, and how to establish ethical boundaries that allow for powerful influence without crossing into exploitation. Manipulation versus ethical influence: the critical distinction. The line between influence and manipulation isn't always obvious, but several key factors consistently differentiate ethical persuasion from exploitative tactics. Transparency versus concealment. Ethical influence is transparent about its goals and methods. While you don't need to explicitly name every persuasion principle you're using, your ultimate objective should be clear to those you're influencing. Manipulation, by contrast, deliberately conceals true intentions, leaving people unaware they're being directed toward someone else's goals. Benefit alignment vs. exploitation. Ethical influence seeks outcomes that benefit all parties, creating value for those being persuaded as well as the persuader. Manipulation pursues one-sided advantage, often at the direct expense of those being influenced. The core question: if the person fully understood the consequences of their decision, would they still consider it beneficial for themselves? Choice enhancement versus choice reduction. Ethical influence presents options clearly, providing information and perspective that helps people make better decisions. Manipulation restricts awareness of alternatives, creates artificial urgency, or otherwise limits the person's ability to make a fully informed choice aligned with their true interests and values. Truth versus deception. Ethical influence may highlight certain facts or frame information advantageously, but it does not include deliberate falsehoods or material omissions that would change someone's decision if known. Manipulation frequently involves outright deception or strategic withholding of information that would affect decision outcomes. Respect versus exploitation of vulnerability. Ethical influence respects human dignity and autonomy, while manipulation specifically targets vulnerabilities, emotional states, cognitive biases, or personal weaknesses, to override rational choice and self-interest. These distinctions aren't always black and white. Most influence exists on a spectrum, with many gray areas where reasonable people might disagree about whether a particular approach crosses ethical lines. The key is maintaining awareness of these factors and regularly examining your own practices with honest self-reflection. Recognizing manipulation, protecting yourself from dark influence. Once you understand the principles of influence, you become better equipped to recognize when they're being used against you in manipulative ways. Several warning signs typically indicate manipulation attempts. Artificial scarcity and urgency. While legitimate scarcity exists, manipulators often manufacture false time pressure and limited availability to force quick decisions without adequate consideration. Limited time offers that mysteriously extend, countdown timers that reset, and vague claims about others competing for the same opportunity all warrant skepticism. Isolation tactics. Manipulators often try to isolate you from other perspectives, discouraging you from seeking second opinions, researching alternatives, or discussing decisions with friends or family. This isolation prevents you from receiving contradictory information that might expose the manipulation. Identity exploitation. Manipulation frequently targets your self-image, suggesting that people like you make certain choices or that failing to comply would betray an identity you value. This exploits the human need for consistency and group belonging to override rational assessment of the actual choice at hand. Artificial reciprocity. While genuine reciprocity builds relationships, manipulators create artificial obligations through unsolicited gifts or minor favors, then exploit the reciprocity principle to extract disproportionate compliance. The sudden, unexpected free sample followed immediately by a major request is a classic example. Authority inflation. Legitimate authority deserves appropriate consideration, but manipulators often inflate, fabricate, or borrow authority signals to trigger automatic compliance. Vague credentials, misleading titles, and association with legitimate authorities without actual endorsement are common tactics. Guilt induction. Manipulation frequently involves creating artificial guilt or shame, then positioning compliance as the way to alleviate these uncomfortable emotions. This strategy bypasses rational decision-making by activating emotional distress that clouds judgment. Forced reciprocation. Unlike legitimate influence that creates voluntary reciprocity, manipulation often forces reciprocation through tactics like speaking rapidly, physically controlling the environment, or creating social pressure that makes refusal awkward or uncomfortable. Recognizing these warning signs allows you to activate conscious evaluation rather than responding automatically to influence triggers. When you notice these tactics, slow down, create space for consideration, seek outside perspectives, and evaluate the request based on your genuine interests rather than the artificial context created by the manipulator. Ethical boundaries. Using influence responsibly. Influence itself is neutral, neither inherently good nor evil. What matters is how and why these principles are applied. Several guidelines can help ensure your use of influence remains ethical. The transparency test. Would you be comfortable if the person you're influencing knew exactly what you were doing and why? Ethical influence doesn't require hiding your methods or objectives. While you don't need to explicitly name every psychological principle you're using, you should be comfortable with full transparency about your ultimate goals. The advice test. Would you recommend the same decision to a loved one in identical circumstances? If you're influencing someone toward a choice you wouldn't want for someone you care about, you're likely crossing ethical lines. Ethical influence aligns with the true best interests of those being influenced. The future self-test. Would the person thank you later for influencing them in this direction? Ethical influence leads to outcomes that people ultimately appreciate, even if the immediate decision feels challenging. If someone would likely regret their decision once they fully understand its consequences, the influence approach deserves reconsideration. The capability enhancement test. Does your influence approach enhance or diminish the person's decision-making capability for future choices? Ethical influence educates while it persuades, leaving people better equipped to make good decisions independently in the future, rather than creating dependency on your guidance. The universal application test. Would you want these influence methods used on you and those you care about? If a particular approach feels objectionable when applied to yourself, it likely crosses ethical boundaries when applied to others. The universalizability of your methods provides a reliable ethical checkpoint. These guidelines don't provide absolute answers for every situation, but they offer practical frameworks for evaluating the ethics of specific influence approaches. By regularly applying these tests to your persuasion practices, you can harness the power of psychological influence while maintaining ethical integrity. Resistance and inoculation. When influence goes too far, even ethical influence can sometimes be unwelcome or counterproductive. Understanding how and why people resist influence helps both in respecting others' boundaries and in recognizing when your own influence attempts might be inappropriate or ineffective. Several psychological mechanisms drive influence resistance. Psychological reactance. When people feel their freedom of choice is threatened, they often respond with direct opposition, a phenomenon psychologists call reactance. This explains why heavy-handed persuasion attempts frequently backfire, creating the exact opposite of the intended effect. The more obvious or aggressive the influence attempt, the stronger the reactance response typically becomes. Identity defense. People instinctively resist influence that threatens their core identities or self-perceptions. When persuasion implies they must abandon or contradict an important aspect of how they see themselves, resistance naturally follows, even when the suggested change might otherwise be beneficial. Trust deficits. Without baseline trust in the influence source, even the most perfectly crafted message will meet resistance. When past experiences, conflicting interests, or reputation issues create trust deficits, influence attempts trigger skepticism rather than receptivity, regardless of their substantive merit. Cognitive overload. When people feel overwhelmed by information, complexity, or pressure, they typically default to the status quo, rejecting influence toward change. This resistance stems not from disagreement with the message, but from the mental burden of processing it adequately under current conditions. Value conflicts. People naturally resist influence that contradicts their core values or moral frameworks, even when the suggested action might benefit them personally. These value-based resistance patterns tend to be stronger and more persistent than resistance based on practical concerns or inconvenience. Understanding these resistance mechanisms allows for more respectful, effective influence that works with rather than against natural psychological patterns. When resistance appears, consider it valuable feedback rather than an obstacle to overcome. It often signals the need to adjust your approach, timing, or perhaps the influence attempt itself. Psychological inoculation. Ethical protection against manipulation. Beyond recognizing manipulation, you can actively strengthen resistance to unwanted influence through psychological inoculation, a process analogous to medical vaccination, where exposure to weakened forms of a threat builds immunity to stronger versions. Several inoculation strategies provide protection against manipulative influence. Cognitive rehearsal. Mentally practicing responses to potential influence attempts strengthens resistance when those attempts actually occur. By pre-planning how you'll respond to sales pressure, emotional appeals, or authority invocations, you reduce their impact in real situations. Bias awareness. Simply knowing about cognitive biases and psychological triggers significantly reduces their effectiveness. When you recognize an influence attempt targeting your loss aversion or social proof tendencies, the automatic response weakens, allowing for more thoughtful evaluation. Warning and refutation. The most studied inoculation technique involves warning about potential influence attempts followed by refuting typical arguments or tactics. This two-step process, here's what they might try, and here's why it's flawed, creates powerful resistance to subsequent persuasion attempts. Implementation intentions. Creating specific if, then plans for handling influence situations strengthens follow-through on resistance intentions. Rather than general commitments, I won't give in to sales pressure, specific implementation intentions. If they say limited time offer, I'll respond with, I need 24 hours to consider any purchase over $100. Dramatically improve resistance effectiveness. Decision boundaries. Establishing clear, predetermined limits before entering influence situations provides protection against in-the-moment persuasion. Examples include setting specific budget caps before shopping, defining exact criteria before evaluating options, or determining time boundaries for consideration before making commitments. These inoculation strategies don't create blanket resistance to all influence, which would block beneficial guidance and information, but rather enhance critical thinking and conscious choice in situations where manipulation might otherwise override thoughtful decision-making. The ultimate influence, transformational impact. Beyond the tactical applications of influence principles lies a deeper possibility, creating transformation rather than merely transaction. While basic influence can change behavior temporarily, transformational influence alters how people think, what they value, and who they become. This highest level of influence doesn't just persuade people to act differently, it inspires them to be different. It doesn't just secure compliance, it catalyzes growth. It doesn't just win agreements, it shifts paradigms. Whether you're a leader seeking to build a movement, a teacher hoping to impact students for life, or simply someone who wants your interaction with others to leave a meaningful legacy, understanding transformational influence reveals the path to impact that endures long after you're gone. The 3 levels of influence, from compliance to transformation. Influence operates at 3 distinct levels, each with different mechanisms and outcomes. Level 1, compliance influence. The most basic level focuses on immediate behavior change, getting someone to say yes, take specific action, or follow directions. Compliance influence relies primarily on external motivators, rewards, punishments, social pressure, or temporary emotional states. While effective for short-term outcomes, compliance typically vanishes when the external motivator is removed. Sales techniques focused purely on closing the immediate deal. Management approaches based entirely on monitoring and incentives, and parenting that relies exclusively on rewards and punishments all operate at this compliance level. The limitation: once the motivating factor disappears, the behavior typically reverts to baseline. Level 2, commitment influence. The intermediate level creates internal motivation that sustains behavior change even without external pressure. Commitment influence works by aligning the requested behavior with the person's existing values, identity, and goals, making compliance feel self-directed rather than externally imposed. When people act because they've internalized the reason for the behavior, when they do something because they want to rather than because they have to, influence gains significant durability. Effective education, good coaching, and values-based leadership all operate at this commitment level. The result: sustained behavior change that persists across contexts and continues even without surveillance or enforcement. Level 3, transformational influence. The highest level changes not just what people do, but who they are, shifting their core values, identity, and worldview. Transformational influence doesn't just connect with existing internal motivation. It creates new motivation by expanding how people see themselves and their possibilities. When transformation occurs, people don't just sustain specific behaviors. They initiate entirely new behaviors aligned with their expanded identity and values. Great mentorship, profound leadership, and life-changing relationships operate at this transformational level. The outcome: cascading change that expands far beyond the specific behaviors initially requested, often affecting areas of life you never directly addressed. Understanding these levels allows you to choose the appropriate approach for your goals. For simple, one-time actions where long-term change isn't necessary, compliance techniques may be sufficient. For sustained behavior change in specific areas, commitment strategies become essential. For profound, far-reaching impact, transformational approaches offer the greatest potential. The psychology of transformation: how people change at the deepest level. While compliance and commitment influence are well understood through standard psychological principles, transformation follows different patterns. Several key psychological mechanisms drive transformational change. Identity evolution. Transformation occurs when people incorporate new elements into their core identity, their fundamental sense of who they are. This identity shift creates cascading behavior change without requiring specific instruction for each new behavior. When someone moves from seeing themselves as a person who exercises sometimes to an athlete, numerous health behaviors naturally align with the new identity without requiring separate influence for each one. Value expansion. Values, our deeply held beliefs about what's important and meaningful, drive countless daily decisions. Transformational influence expands or reprioritizes these values, creating natural motivation toward new behaviors aligned with the evolved value system. When someone adds environmental sustainability to their core values, for instance, dozens of consumption behaviors shift automatically. Paradigm shifts. Our mental models, how we understand and interpret the world, determine what we notice, what we believe is possible, and what actions we consider. Transformation often involves paradigm shifts that fundamentally alter these mental models, creating new possibilities that weren't previously visible. A shift from business is about maximizing profit to business is about creating value for all stakeholders, for example, transforms countless decisions without requiring separate persuasion for each one. Emotional resolution. Transformational change frequently involves resolving emotional blocks or healing past wounds that have constrained growth. When people experience emotional resolution around fears, limiting beliefs, or unprocessed experiences, energy previously consumed by these issues becomes available for growth and new behavior. This emotional component explains why purely cognitive approaches often fail to create deep change. Transcendent purpose. Humans are naturally motivated by meaning, by connection to something larger than themselves. Transformation often involves awakening or strengthening this connection to transcendent purpose, whether through contribution to others, alignment with deeply held values, or participation in something that extends beyond one's individual life. When people feel their actions serve a meaningful purpose, motivation becomes intrinsic rather than requiring external management. Unlike compliance or commitment influence, transformation rarely happens through direct persuasion alone. Instead, it typically emerges through experiences that engage these deeper psychological mechanisms, experiences that challenge existing identity, expand perspective, create emotional breakthrough, or connect actions to meaningful purpose. Creating transformational experiences. The catalyst approach. While transformation can't be forced or manipulated, you can intentionally create conditions that catalyze transformative change. Several approaches consistently facilitate transformation. Disconfirmation experiences. Transformation often begins when reality conflicts with existing beliefs or expectations in ways that can't be easily dismissed. These disconfirmation experiences create cognitive dissonance that can lead to fundamental reevaluation rather than minor adjustments, providing opportunities to directly experience evidence that challenges limiting beliefs, rather than merely discussing that evidence, creates potential transformation catalysts. Threshold experiences. Major life transitions, whether chosen or imposed, create natural openings for transformation. These threshold experiences temporarily disrupt established patterns and identities, creating space for new possibilities. Rites of passage, career changes, relocations, and other significant transitions provide natural opportunities for transformational influence. Immersive learning. While information alone rarely creates transformation, immersive experiences that engage multiple learning channels simultaneously can catalyze profound change. Approaches that combine intellectual understanding, emotional engagement, social interaction, and direct practice create integrated learning that reshapes both thinking and behavior at fundamental levels. Aspirational modeling. People naturally emulate those they admire, often unconsciously adopting values, perspectives, and behaviors from role models who embody qualities they aspire to develop. Being or providing access to aspirational models, people who demonstrate expanded possibilities in relevant domains, creates natural templates for transformation without requiring explicit persuasion. Reflection facilitation. Transformation requires integration, making meaning from experiences and connecting that meaning to identity, values, and future action. Structured reflection through powerful questions, guided journaling, facilitated dialogue, or other meaning-making practices helps convert experiences into lasting transformation rather than temporary impact. Purpose connection. Helping people connect specific behaviors to their deeper values and meaningful purpose converts what might otherwise be burdensome requirements into expressions of authentic identity. This purpose connection transforms, into want to, creating sustainable motivation that outlasts any external influence. These catalyst approaches don't manipulate or force transformation, but rather create conditions where transformative change becomes more likely. They respect autonomy while providing experiences, connections, and frameworks that support growth at the deepest levels. The ethics of transformational influence. With great power comes great responsibility. While transformational influence offers the potential for profound positive impact, it also carries significant ethical obligations. Several principles should guide transformational approaches. Consent and transparency. Unlike manipulation, ethical transformation respects autonomy by being transparent about intended outcomes and obtaining meaningful consent for experiences designed to catalyze change. While you can't predict every specific change that might emerge, the general nature and purpose of transformational experiences should be clear to participants. Authentic alignment. Ethical transformation connects people more deeply with their authentic values and aspirations rather than imposing external agendas. The goal isn't to make someone into what you want them to be, but to help them become more fully who they truly are, with greater capacity to express their unique gifts and fulfill their personal potential. Do no harm. Transformational experiences can be emotionally intense and sometimes temporarily destabilizing as old patterns give way to new growth. Ethical practice includes ensuring appropriate safety, support, and containment for these experiences, particularly when working with vulnerable populations or addressing sensitive issues. Ongoing choice. Even after initial consent, ethical transformation maintains ongoing choice rather than creating pressure or manipulation. Participants should always retain the right to pause, modify, or withdraw from transformational processes without shame, judgment, or artificial consequence. Appropriate authority. The right to facilitate transformational experiences is earned through a combination of relevant knowledge, skill, personal development, and appropriate relationship. Ethical practitioners recognize the boundaries of their competence and authority, referring to others when a particular transformational need exceeds their capacity or falls outside their legitimate role. When these ethical principles guide transformational influence, the result isn't manipulation but liberation, helping people overcome limitations, fulfill potential, and live more authentically aligned with their deepest values and highest aspirations. Advanced application, influence in specific contexts. Now that we've explored the foundational principles of influence and their ethical application, let's examine how these principles manifest in specific contexts. Different environments involve unique dynamics, constraints, and opportunities that shape how influence operates and what approaches prove most effective. Digital influence, persuasion in a virtual world. The digital realm creates both challenges and opportunities for influence, with several distinctive dynamics shaping persuasion effectiveness. Attention scarcity. In physical environments, once you have someone's presence, you typically have at least some of their attention. In digital contexts, you may have technical presence, someone on your website or following your account, without actual attention. This attention scarcity means digital influence begins not with persuasion, but with capturing and maintaining focus in an environment designed for constant distraction. Trust barriers. Digital interactions lack many traditional trust signals found in physical encounters. Eye contact, body language, tone of voice, social context. This trust deficit makes establishing credibility more challenging but also more valuable. Digital influence requires deliberate trust building through consistency, transparency, social proof, and value delivery before persuasion can succeed. Reduced friction. While capturing attention and building trust are more difficult digitally, action mechanics are often simpler. The Buy Now button is just one click away, lowering the practical barriers to conversion once persuasion occurs. This reduced friction explains why digital persuasion often emphasizes removing psychological resistance rather than practical obstacles. Tailored experiences. Unlike mass media, digital environments enable unprecedented personalization, allowing influence attempts to adapt in real time to individual behavior, preferences, and responses. This customization capacity makes testing, optimization, and tailored messaging far more powerful in digital contexts than in traditional media. Specific digital influence strategies reflect these unique dynamics. Sequential engagement. Rather than attempting full persuasion in a single interaction, effective digital influence often uses sequential micro-commitments, small, low-risk actions that build toward larger conversion goals while establishing engagement patterns. Social validation integration. Digital platforms excel at displaying social metrics, likes, shares, reviews, follower counts, making social proof more visible and immediately impactful than in physical environments. Strategic integration of these social signals throughout the user journey significantly enhances persuasion. Pattern interruption. In environments where audiences have developed banner blindness and reflexively ignore conventional marketing formats, pattern interruption, content that breaks expected formats through novelty, surprise, or violation of expectations, becomes essential for initial attention capture. Value-first sequences. Digital influence increasingly relies on providing substantial value before requesting action, creating reciprocity and demonstrating capability. This teach, don't sell, approach addresses trust barriers by establishing credibility through genuine contribution rather than mere claims. The most effective digital influence combines these specialized approaches with the universal psychological principles we've explored, adapting timeless influence mechanism to the unique opportunities and constraints of virtual environments. Sales psychology, the science of purchase decisions. Few contexts apply influence principles more deliberately than sales, where persuasion directly impacts measurable outcomes. Understanding the psychology of purchase decisions reveals why certain sales approaches consistently outperform others. The decision timeline. Purchase psychology follows distinct phases, each requiring different influence approaches. Problem awareness, highlighting pain points and consequences of inaction. Solution exploration, establishing solution criteria and desired outcomes. Evaluation, providing evidence while managing comparison frameworks. Uncertainty management, addressing specific fears and risk factors. Decision, facilitating commitment while reducing cognitive dissonance. Post-purchase, reinforcing decision wisdom and identity alignment. Effective sales influence adapts to the buyer's current phase rather than applying one-size-fits-all persuasion regardless of where the person stands in their decision process. The confirmation bias in sales. Buyers don't evaluate options objectively. They seek information that confirms their existing inclinations while filtering out contradictory evidence. This bias explains why effective selling begins by understanding the buyer's current beliefs and preferences, then aligning messages with those existing views rather than directly challenging them. Psychological ownership. People value what they already feel is theirs, even before formal purchase. Creating psychological ownership through customization, configuration, free trials, or even mental visualization creates an endowment effect that increases perceived value and purchase likelihood. This explains why car salespeople encourage test drives and software companies offer free trials. Once you've experienced ownership, giving it up feels like a loss. Decision simplification. As options multiply, decision paralysis increases. Effective sales influence doesn't overwhelm with endless features and options, but rather simplifies decision-making through curated choices, clear frameworks, and decision shortcuts. This simplification reduces the cognitive burden of purchasing, making action more likely. Identity alignment. Beyond practical benefits, purchases often serve identity needs, helping people express or reinforce who they are or aspire to be. When products or services connect to identity, this is for people like you, or this helps you become who you want to be. Motivation transcends mere utility calculations to include deeper psychological rewards. The most ethical and effective sales approaches recognize that purchasing decisions blend rational and emotional factors. Rather than targeting one while ignoring the other, they address both dimensions, helping buyers make decisions they'll ultimately find satisfying rather than merely securing short-term transactions. Leadership influence, moving from authority to inspiration. While leadership traditionally relied on formal authority and compliance mechanisms, modern environments increasingly require influence beyond what position alone can provide. Several psychological factors distinguish high-influence leadership from mere authority. Purpose translation. Exceptional leaders don't just communicate what needs to be done. They connect immediate tasks to meaningful purpose, helping people understand how specific actions contribute to larger goals they genuinely care about. This purpose connection transforms compliance, "I have to do this," into commitment, "I want to do this," creating self-sustained motivation. Vision manifestation. While goals specify targets, vision creates mental imagery of a desirable future that feels both inspiring and attainable. High-influence leaders use concrete examples, vivid language, and emotion-activating stories to make abstract aspirations tangible, allowing people to mentally inhabit the future state before it exists. Values embodiment. Value statements on walls rarely change behavior, but leaders who visibly embody values through consistent action create powerful influence through behavioral modeling. When values are personified rather than merely proclaimed, they shape cultural norms that guide countless individual decisions without requiring direct oversight. Recognition precision. Generic praise has limited motivational impact, but specific recognition that highlights exactly what someone did well and connects it to meaningful outcomes creates powerful reinforcement. Precision matters. Recognizing particular behaviors rather than general qualities dramatically increases the likelihood those behaviors will continue and spread. Psychological safety. Innovation, collaboration, and initiative require psychological safety. The belief that taking interpersonal risks won't lead to punishment or humiliation. Leaders who create this safety through appropriate vulnerability, constructive response to mistakes, and genuine curiosity enable influence through environment shaping rather than direct control. Growth facilitation. The most influential leaders focus less on extracting performance from people in their current state and more on developing expanded capabilities that enable new levels of contribution. This growth emphasis creates loyalty, engagement, and discretionary effort that compliance-focused approaches rarely achieve. These influence mechanisms explain why some leaders inspire extraordinary commitment and performance, while others with similar formal authority struggle to generate even basic compliance. The difference isn't positional power, but rather psychological understanding, translated into consistent practice. Negotiation psychology, the science of agreement. Negotiation represents influence in its most explicit form, an acknowledged attempt to shape outcomes with others who have their own objectives. Several psychological principles determine negotiation effectiveness. Anchoring effects. The first number mentioned in negotiation disproportionately influences the final outcome by establishing a reference point for subsequent offers. This explains why strategic anchoring, opening with a number that pulls the eventual agreement in your desired direction, significantly impacts results, even when the initial offer isn't accepted. Loss-gain asymmetry. People feel losses approximately twice as strongly as equivalent gains. This asymmetry explains why framing the same proposal as avoiding a loss, preventing $10,000 in wasted expenses, creates more motivation than framing it as securing an equivalent gain, saving $10,000. Effective negotiators consciously match their framing to the outcome they seek. Reciprocity sequences. The pattern of concessions in negotiation carries psychological significance beyond the content of the concessions themselves. Multiple small concessions typically generate more positive response than a single large concession of equivalent value, because each instance activates the reciprocity principle anew. Fairness perception. People reject objectively beneficial offers they perceive as unfair, even at personal cost. This explains why establishing legitimate criteria, industry standards, precedent, objective metrics that define fairness often proves more effective than pure interest-based haggling. Implementation, psychological ownership. The party who drafts an agreement gains subtle psychological advantage, not through deception but through natural framing effects and language choices that shape how terms are understood and interpreted. This explains why control of document creation often proves as important as the terms themselves. Future relationship value. Unlike one-time transactions, most negotiations occur within ongoing relationships where future value far exceeds immediate terms. This relationship context explains why effective negotiators consider not just the agreement itself, but how the negotiation process affects trust, goodwill, and subsequent interactions. These psychological dimensions reveal why negotiation success depends less on aggressive tactics or positional bargaining, and more on understanding the cognitive and emotional factors that shape how people evaluate options, make decisions, and commit to agreements. Persuasive communication, the science of messaging. Whether in marketing, public speaking, or everyday conversation, how you structure and deliver messages significantly impacts their persuasive power. Research in cognitive psychology and communication science reveals several principles that enhance message effectiveness. Processing fluency. Messages that are easier to process through clear language, intuitive structure, and familiar concepts are perceived as more trustworthy and accurate than equivalent content presented in complex, abstract, or difficult-to-process formats. This fluency effect explains why simplicity enhances persuasion even with sophisticated audiences. Dual-channel processing. People process messages through both rational analysis, central root, and peripheral cues, source credibility, presentation quality, emotional appeals. Effective persuasion addresses both channels, providing substantive content for analytical evaluation while simultaneously optimizing peripheral signals that influence intuitive judgment. Narrative transportation. Stories create psychological transportation, a state where people mentally enter the narrative world, reducing counter-arguing and analytical resistance. This transportation effect explains why case studies, examples, and narrative illustrations often prove more persuasive than abstract statistics or conceptual arguments, even when the factual content is identical. Message inoculation. Directly addressing likely objections, rather than ignoring them, strengthens persuasion by reducing counter-arguing and demonstrating fairness. This counterintuitive approach, called inoculation, works because acknowledged objections lose persuasive power, while unaddressed objections grow stronger in the listener's mind. Concrete specificity. Specific, tangible examples create stronger mental imagery and emotional response than equivalent abstract descriptions. This concreteness effect explains why she donated $4,827 to build 3 wells providing clean water to 247 families, creates stronger impact than she gave a substantial amount to support clean water initiatives. Value bridging. Connecting your message to values the audience already holds, rather than challenging those values, reduces resistance and creates persuasive pathways. This bridging approach allows people to see how new perspectives or actions align with their existing beliefs rather than requiring value revision. These principles apply across communication contexts, explaining why certain messages resonate and inspire action while others, containing similar factual content, fail to influence attitudes or behavior. The difference isn't just what you say, but how you structure, frame, and deliver the message. Applied mastery, bringing it all together. We've explored dozens of psychological principles, examined their application across contexts, and considered the ethical boundaries of influence. Now let's focus on practical mastery, how to integrate these insights into a unified approach that works in real-world situations. The Influence Blueprint, a strategic framework. Rather than viewing influence as a collection of isolated techniques, effective practitioners develop a coherent strategic framework that guides their approach across situations. This influence blueprint consists of 5 key elements. 1. Outcome clarity. Before attempting influence, define precisely what outcome you seek, not just the immediate action but the ultimate result, including the specific behavior or decision you want, the mindset you hope to create, the why behind compliance, the relationship quality you aim to maintain or develop, the precedent you want to establish for future interactions. This clarity prevents the common mistake of winning the immediate battle while undermining longer-term objectives. 2. Audience understanding. Effective influence begins with deep understanding of those you hope to influence. Current beliefs, values, and perspectives on the relevant topic. Existing knowledge and frames of reference. Primary motivations and concerns related to the decision. Decision-making style and preferences. Relationship context and trust level. This understanding allows you to start where people actually are rather than where you wish they were, significantly enhancing persuasive impact. 3. Pathway design. Based on audience understanding, design a psychological pathway from current state to desired outcome. What sequence of thoughts and feelings will most naturally lead to your desired result? Which psychological principles are most relevant given the specific person and context? What potential resistance points might emerge, and how will you address them? What evidence, stories, or experiences will most effectively support your influence goals? This pathway creates a roadmap for influence rather than relying on improvisation alone. 4. Execution excellence. The most brilliant influence strategy fails without effective execution. What communication channel is most appropriate for this particular influence attempt? How will you establish initial attention and engagement? What specific language will most effectively activate relevant psychological triggers? How will your non-verbal communication and presentation align with your verbal message? What timing considerations might affect receptivity to your influence attempt? These execution elements transform strategy into effective action. 5. Feedback integration. Effective influencers continually refine their approach based on results. What indicators will show whether your influence is succeeding or struggling? How will you elicit feedback, direct or indirect, during the influence process? What adjustments are you prepared to make if initial approaches don't generate desired outcomes? How will you capture lessons for application in future influence situations? This feedback loop converts each influence attempt into a learning opportunity that enhances future effectiveness. When these elements work together as an integrated system rather than isolated techniques, influence becomes more natural, ethical, and effective across diverse situations and relationships. The three dimensions of influence mastery. Beyond specific techniques and strategies, true influence mastery develops along three dimensions that expand your capacity to shape outcomes in any context. Psychological intelligence. This dimension involves understanding the cognitive and emotional factors that drive human behavior, recognizing how specific psychological principles apply in particular situations, identifying the unique pattern of motivations, concerns, and thinking styles in individuals, discerning unspoken needs and unstated objection that affect receptivity, detecting resistance, engagement, and other response signals accurately, anticipating how people will react to different approaches and messages. This psychological intelligence allows you to navigate the human dimension of influence with precision, rather than relying on one-size-fits-all approaches. Strategic adaptability. This dimension involves flexible application of influence principles across varying contexts, adjusting approaches based on relationship type, setting, and circumstances, selecting appropriate influence channels for specific messages and audiences, modifying techniques when standard approaches encounter resistance, integrating multiple influence principles into coherent, situation-specific strategies, creating new approaches by combining or extending established principles. This adaptability prevents the common mistake of becoming skilled with a limited set of techniques that work in some situations but fail in others. Personal congruence. This dimension involves authentic alignment between your influence approach and your identity, developing influence styles that match your natural strength and personality, ensuring consistency between your message content and your delivery, aligning your influence goals with your values and long-term objectives, cultivating genuine conviction in the positions you advocate, building the internal states that naturally project credibility and impact. This congruence dimension explains why mechanical application of influence techniques often feels manipulative and ineffective, while influence flowing from authentic alignment creates powerful impact. Without apparent effort, development across all three dimensions creates influence mastery that manifests not as a collection of techniques, but as an integrated capacity to shape outcomes while building trust and creating value for all involved. From knowledge to embodiment, the practice of influence. Understanding influence principles intellectually differs significantly from applying them effectively in real situations. The journey from knowledge to embodiment, where influence becomes natural rather than mechanical, requires deliberate practice. Several approaches accelerate this development. Situational analysis. Regularly review past and anticipated influence situations, examining which psychological principles were or might be most relevant, what worked or would likely work in this specific context, what resistance emerged or might emerge, and why, how you might have adjusted or might adjust your approach for better results. This analytical practice builds the mental models needed for effective real-time application. Micro-skill development. Break influence into component skills for focused practice. Nonverbal communication elements, eye contact, vocal modulation posture. Question formulation for different influence purposes. Story construction and delivery for persuasive impact. Objection anticipation and preemptive addressing. Perspective taking and empathetic response. By isolating these elements for deliberate practice, You develop fundamentals that combine into natural influence capacity. Environmental design. Create conditions that support your influence development. Surround yourself with models who demonstrate effective influence. Establish feedback mechanisms that provide insight into your impact. Structure opportunities to practice specific influence approaches. Create reminders for applying key principles in relevant situations. Build accountability for implementing what you're learning. This environmental scaffolding supports consistent application until new approaches become habitual. Reflection routines. Establish regular reflection practices to accelerate learning. Journaling about influence attempts, outcomes, and insights. Debriefing significant interactions to identify patterns and improvement opportunities. Comparing your approach to influence models you respect or aspire to emulate. Connecting influence experiences to deeper values and purpose. Celebrating progress while identifying next development priorities. These reflection routines convert experience into expertise, accelerating growth beyond what practice alone can accomplish. The progression from mechanical application of influence techniques to embodied influence mastery resembles learning any complex skill. From initially conscious and sometimes awkward implementation to eventual integration, where the principles become part of who you are rather than just what you do. The ethical imperative, power and responsibility. As we conclude our exploration of influence, we return to the ethical dimension that must guide all application of these powerful principles. The capacity to shape others' perceptions, decisions, and actions carries inherent responsibility that grows with increasing influence skill. Several commitments define ethical influence practice. Truth orientation. Ethical influence prioritizes truthfulness in both content and process. Presenting facts accurately without distortion or material omission. Making clear distinctions between established facts, reasonable interpretations, and speculative possibilities. Acknowledging legitimate alternatives and counterarguments. Avoiding misleading implications, even when statements are technically accurate. Correcting misperceptions, even when they might temporarily serve your influence goals. This commitment to truth doesn't require disclosing every detail or abandoning strategic framing, but it does establish boundaries that maintain integrity while exercising influence. Benefit balance. Ethical influence creates value for all parties, rather than extracting value from those influenced. Pursuing outcomes that genuinely benefit the influenced person or group. Ensuring that potential risks and downsides are clearly understood. Aiming for fair distribution of benefits rather than one-sided advantage. Considering long-term impacts beyond immediate outcomes. Respecting the autonomy and dignity of those you influence. This benefit orientation transforms influence from exploitation to service, building relationships characterized by mutual value rather than zero-sum dynamics. Conscious development. Ethical influence includes ongoing development of both skill and character. Continually expanding your understanding of influence principles and their impacts. Developing greater discernment about appropriate application in specific contexts. Building awareness of your blind spots and potential biases. Seeking feedback on both the effectiveness and ethics of your influence approaches. Cultivating the wisdom to match your growing influence capacity. This developmental commitment recognizes that ethical influence requires not just knowledge of boundaries, but continual growth in the discretion to apply powerful principles appropriately. Legacy perspective. Ultimately, ethical influence considers the ripple effects that extend far beyond immediate interactions. How will your influence shape not just immediate decisions but long-term patterns? What precedents are you establishing for how influence should be exercised? How are you affecting not just behaviors, but the development of those you influence? What would the widespread adoption of your influence approaches create in your community or society? What story will your influence practices tell about who you are and what you stand for? This legacy perspective elevates influence from tactical effectiveness to meaningful contribution, using the principles we've explored not just to achieve immediate goals, but to create positive impact that extends far beyond the specific situations where influence is applied. As we reach the conclusion of our exploration, remember that influence isn't something you do occasionally. It's something you exercise in every interaction, whether consciously or unconsciously. Every conversation, every relationship, every role you play involves shaping others' perceptions, decisions, and behaviors in some way. The question isn't whether you'll influence others, but whether you'll do so with intention, skill, and ethical purpose. The principles we've explored provide the foundation for influence that doesn't manipulate or exploit, but rather creates genuine value, builds meaningful relationships, and contributes to positive outcomes for all involved. Your journey with these principles doesn't end with understanding them intellectually. It continues as you apply them in daily life, refine your approach through experience, and develop the wisdom to wield these powerful tools with both effectiveness and integrity. The world desperately needs ethical influence in leadership, in business, in relationships, in communities. As you develop your capacity to shape outcomes while honoring truth and creating mutual benefit, you contribute something essential to those around you. Use these principles wisely, practice them diligently, apply them ethically, and watch as your capacity to create positive impact grows in ways that benefit not just you, but everyone your influence touches. If you found this audiobook valuable, I encourage you to take action on what you've learned. Begin applying these principles in your daily interactions, observe the results, and continue refining your approach. Also, please consider sharing your experience with others by leaving a review, subscribing to our channel, or recommending this audiobook to friends or colleagues who might benefit from these insights. Your support helps us continue creating content that makes a meaningful difference. Remember, influence isn't just about getting what you want. It's about creating positive outcomes that serve everyone involved. When you master the psychology of influence with both skill and integrity, you don't just change outcomes, you change lives. Thank you for joining me on this journey into the fascinating world of human psychology and influence. I wish you success, fulfillment, and positive impact as you apply these principles in your own life and work.